Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today with us, we have Dr. Hyung. We'll be discussing South Korea's security posture and geopolitical concerns, especially after the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in China recently. Um, Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you are involved in this area?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me. I currently serve as the president of the Security Management Institute, which is affiliated with the South Korean National Assembly. Basic task that I do on a daily basis is defense consulting to each branch of the military. And long before where I'm here right now, I've studied like international relations, more specifically international security. And after many years, I think it became kind of a norm, a natural kind of a destination for me to spend a lot of time in defense issues. Um, I think based on my background, educational background, and my long years in research in this field have naturally led me to look into these security issues concerning the Far East.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So let's start with the basics for our audiences. We are seeing
Uh-huh.
an increasing evolution and diversification in North Korean missile capabilities.
Uh-huh.
How has the Republic of Korea security doctrine evolved in response to this increasing precision and diversity of these capabilities?
Thank you for a very critical question. So, as you might aware, and of course the audience might be aware, ever since the Korean Armistice after 3 years of Korean War in 1953, our defense mechanism or the defense framework had been developed against possible North Korean threats. But I think recent, like 20 years, has become a huge evolution from the South Korean side because of the growing unprecedented North Korean threat, including missile threats that you have pointed out. So basically, against the North Korean missile capability, which is coupled with their nuclear warheads, we have developed a defense framework, which is called like the three-axis system. But simply put, it's a missile defense mechanisms with other measures that we have currently investing on to develop. But unfortunately, North Korea is also evolving and enhancing their capabilities. So even with the current plans to build our kind of missile defense mechanisms, we're still have loopholes against their North Korea's hyperglide missiles, for instance. So we're building on our weapons defense framework, but it's still an ongoing process.
So essentially, it's a race and one that is not an easy to catch up on. Um, but in light of that, in light of this effort to keep up with this evolution, in what ways is Seoul balancing its growing emphasis on indigenous defense development with continued reliance on the U.S. alliance and on other countries?
Okay, so um, well, basically there are political kind of reasons that we cannot adopt all U.S. Weapon systems, and in terms of certain categories weapons that U.S. possess, they do not sell certain categories. So I think the South Korean government has come to a conclusion that we're going to have to build a lot of categories of weapons indigenously in
Mhm.
order to enhance our defense against North Korean threat. But we found out that I mean, it's all about economics of scales, right? I mean, we have a
Mhm.
large ground forces and we have to field a lot of, missiles, artilleries. But we found out that all across the world, when, in the post-Cold War, many of these countries in the world have reduced their, armament productions and whatever, South Korea have maintained a large pool of weapon production capability. And we found out amidst of this regional conflicts, we were able to immediately produce and deliver weapons to the peoples who demand those weapons. So first of all, I think it was to defend our country, but it turned out to be that it is another opportunity for South Korean defense export. So that had happened to be the way.
And what do you see as the future of South Korean exports? What types of weapons do you see being produced specifically in competition to with other industry giants in this field?
Okay, so South Korean defense export has showcased a huge kind of increase in recent years, especially the year 2022, the same year when Russia invaded Ukraine. And ever since our defense export have somewhat reduced, we have lost kind of momentum. So the defense industry and the government have came to a conclusion that direct competition with, for instance, like US or other defense exports countries like UK and France would be unsustainable for South Korea. So we're trying to find a niche market, a defense, hardwares that we would not have to directly compete with this traditional weapons, producers. So we're trying to figure out what we can do best, and in order to lessen the competition in the traditional fields. So I can give you examples, but I mean, you can give you more specific questions if you'd like to. I know my thoughts more about it.
Would be curious to hear about more examples, sure.
So examples. Okay, so for example, until recently, we were able to compete with, for instance, like the U.S. and France and UK and other traditional, defense companies. For instance, exporting howitzers, K9 howitzers to, for instance, Norway. But we have faced recently to a kind of a limitation that we try to sell even more items like tanks. But we found out that unlike other weapon systems, main battle tanks need to be more has to have a higher interoperability with the NATO standard and the US standard. So in that terms, we have a long way to go. So we have concluded that a direct competition neck and neck with the US and other European defense companies would be less competitive from our perspective. So we are trying to target countries in the Middle East and, for instance, in the other Southeast Asian countries with air defense, items or anti-tank missiles kind of stuff, which guarantees almost equal capability to U.S. and other advanced countries' capability, but with the price tag of say 1/3 of them. So we're trying to find ways to maintain our export momentum by targeting defense items that are less competitive from the world.
In the meanwhile, how does the country reconcile the push for a nuclear-powered submarine program with the regional arms control sensitivities and U.S. proliferation concerns? Is it really a concern, all things considered?
Can you rephrase your question? It's a kind of yeah.
Essentially, my question is about South Korea's push for domestic nuclear missile, nuclear submarines, and whether previous concerns about regional arms control and U.S. concerns about proliferation of nuclear capable weapons is still a concern, or whether that's changing.
Yes, I mean, when it comes to the public opinion, we have greater kind of like a lot more people than before are actually for even a indigenous nuclear capability of Korea, and that includes having our own nuclear powered submarines. But I think the most important restraint would be the U.S. perspective, U.S. point of view. But so far, U.S. Wasn't so fond of those ideas, and I think I mean we were contemplating about having nuclear subs, but I think in order to overcome, U.S. restraints or U.S. opposition, we're going to have to either face a huge threat that would necessitate for us to, arm, or we would have to, convince the U.S. That we're going to have to equip us with the nuclear subs. But the current kind of opinion, discussed with both U.S. and Korea is that we can find other ways to fill up the vacuum. Instead of having nuclear powered sub, we could actually enhance other conventional weaponries in order to enhance our deterrence or defense capabilities. So not necessarily having a nuclear powered sub is necessary. That is the continuous kind of argument from the U.S. side. So to make long story short, I think if like North Korean threats, increases to an overwhelming degree, and if there aren't any kind of a clear solutions for that, I think that would allow or enable us to take the option of building our own nuclear sub. But so far, I think we haven't reached that level, I think.
Do you see something similar to the AUKUS coalition with Australia now purchasing or building nuclear subs in conjunction with the UK and the United States? Is that a possibility if South Korea were to join a similar bloc or alliance?
That's a very important question. But I think there's kind of uniqueness among different types of U.S. alliances. Like Australia, it's like Five Eyes countries. They share some cultural affinity, and they have been cooperating in the intelligence sharing field for many, many years. So it's not in an unequal field to compare with Australia and Korea. And you're going to also have to factor in the geographical location of Australia. I mean, like Australia needs a long distance patrol capability, so nuclear subs are somewhat kind of justified. However, in the field and where South Korea is situated geographically, we are surrounded by superpowers. We're at the vicinity of China, Russia, North Korea, and Japan. So procuring or having a nuclear sub in this very flashpoint, in this very sensitive region, has a very huge political implications, not only for us, but also to Japan and to China. So I guess one of the reasons why South Korea cannot be compared to Australia and introducing certain sensitive weapons, we have even more burden, is that there are more possibly of regional escalation that could escalate fast. So I think Korea needs more kind of a requirements or other conditions in order to follow suit with the AUKUS countries for procuring, having certain weapon systems.
To what extent do domestic political divisions constrain or accelerate Seoul's ability to adopt a long-term and bipartisan security vision? Is it really an issue anymore?
Okay, so I think among a lot of issues that we have on security issue, the most prominent or the most important discussion is about the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. So there are some poll results that a lot of South Koreans, not all of them, but a lot of South Koreans believe that U.S. might not honor its commitment if North Korea fires its, for instance, tactical nukes. And such doubts has increased in recent months because there were some, war game results released by the U.S. That is assuming that U.S. would not retaliate with nuclear weapons against, North Korean nuclear attacks against South Korea. So those simulations are on paper, but it really reflects some of the key decision makers' kind of thoughts on extended deterrence. So I guess under such crumbling credibility issues, that might, I guess, strongly motivate us to build our own deterrence capability. And of course, U.S. Would persuade that they will honor its commitment as declared. But at the same time, we have also Seoul have also asked, like U.S., for instance, to redeploy tactical nukes to South Korean territory, but also U.S. Has declined such options. So it's a kind of a never-ending kind of a story between the two countries. But I think amidst of growing North Korean threats, I guess at certain points, South Korea would take certain options to, I guess, like fill the vacuum if we do not believe U.S. extended deterrence. So it's a credibility issue. It's an intangible issue. So that's a very delicate issue, but I think it's creating a heated debate among South Koreans recently when it comes to defense issues.
Is there an assessment that the U.S. domestic politics, especially during Trump's second term, uh, essentially are pushing Seoul towards more political and military hedging?
So one of the elements that caused more concerns from Seoul is that, as you have witnessed, like after Trump coming into the White House for a second time this year, he have clearly demonstrated his uneasiness on, U.S. alliances, both in Europe and in East Asia. Their free riding, tendency. So the defense minister Hackness have also argued that U.S. allies have to pay more price, pay more burden, and that is also coupled with the credibility issue. So in that case, why not we create our own defense framework in order to defend ourselves? Because given Trump's rhetoric, it's even unsure whether U.S. would honor its commitment. So I think the credibility issues has not been created recently. It was an ongoing issue ever since North Korea started testing their missiles. However, the inauguration of Trump this year has created another layer of pressure for us to make critical decisions. Yeah.
And in that regard, do you think North Korea's evolving use of cyber operations and information warfare could it erode South Korea's resilience more effectively than even the kinetic threats?
Okay. So we are most concerned of North Korean, but no, not just kinetic or cyber, warfare separately, but the combination of those two domains would be create the most negative, like nightmarish, like scenarios for us. So, for instance, like the South Korean military are currently evaluating like what would be North Korea's like enhanced combat capability after sending their troops to the European front in recent years. They have garnered new tactics. They have gained new experience in the front lines in the war zones. So what type of capability they have garnered, and how could they implement those tactics to South Korea if a war occurs? But we believe that if a full-fledged war or a regional provocations actually happens, it's not going to be just simply a cyber attack. It's not going to be a kinetic attack, but it will be a combination of different elements. So the nightmarish scenario that we are currently contemplating is like North Korea might conduct a nuclear threat, nuclear blackmail, but at the same time, they'll use some of their special operating forces to the rear of South Korea in order to create chaos. And at the same time, they can conduct some conventional regional provocation near the DMZ by adopting their newly, learned tactics in the European front. So these type of combination, together with the cyber attack, because they have in the past attempted to neutralize, for instance, our grids and our kind of banking industries or the nuclear facilities. So I think the combination of those tactics simultaneously is what makes us very concerned these days.
Given the questions regarding the U.S. extended deterrence credibility, and given the fact that this administration has already been sort of cutting back on cooperation with European allies in cyber security realm and other operations, how do you think adversaries such as North Korea view the situation? If Seoul is concerned about this matter, don't you think that adversarial countries are also making their own calculations based off of that?
That's one of the most concerning issues for South Korea. Um, like it's kind of a very disturbing developments so far. There is a evolving bloc of North Korea, Russia, and China. I
Mhm.
mean, they have their own differences for the past like couple of decades, but a recent alignment has been kind of unprecedented, I think. And meanwhile, it's kind of a resembling right before the First World War. Each bloc, the Democratic side and the North Korea, Russia, and China has become more rigid. But coming back to the North Korea's calculation, uh, it's problematic because when it comes to South Korea's kind of allies, I mean, we have a bilateral like security treaty with the U.S., but in the Far East we have a trilateral security cooperation among U.S., Japan, and Korea. Uh, but between Japan and South Korea, we do not have any security pact, as you know. So that's the weakest link in the trilateral security cooperation. And North Korea well knows such weaknesses, and they're trying to drive a wedge in between Japan and South Korea. They have tried a lot of tactics, and it's kind of a fact that sowing dispute between the two countries is the easiest way to weaken the trilateral security structure. And occasionally, there are a lot of domestic political issues and historical issues between the two countries that have overwhelmed and marred the security bond. And given the nuclear decoupling issue, I think the most important audience that we have to convince that U.S. extended deterrents are rock solid in this region is not eventually South Korea or Japan, but it's actually to convince North Korea that the mechanisms are airtightly going to be applied. But also, as you pointed out, North Korea is very carefully observing the recent developments. But I think, unfortunately, in comparison to the North Korea, Russia, China bloc, the Japan, Korea, and U.S. bloc is not, consolidating sufficiently enough. So we're racing against the other blocs, but I think we're not doing enough so far. Due to our democratic, political systems, we're going to have to factor in the leadership changes and our domestic opinions, public opinions. And North Korea, for example, has in a good position to actually exploit such divergent ideas and those political differences. So it's a concerning situation.
So there is sort of a lack of resilience to this sort of internal meddling by other countries. And amidst all of this, we're also seeing leadership changes in Japan. We're seeing a
Mm-hmm.
nuclear debate in Japan over whether or not to arm. Do you think something like that could become an issue in South Korea? A debate over whether to uh, pursue independent nuclear capabilities, often considered. The US, the fact that other countries are now entering the same race as well.
Okay, so regarding this very topic, I've met a number of Japanese reporters and discussed the same. I actually asked the same questions then, uh, but we came to a conclusion, a consensus that yes, the leadership change would create some consequences reflecting the candidate's kind of personal stance on security affairs or his or her kind of beliefs on issues when it comes to security. But the Japanese, as far as I'm concerned, right now, they said despite who comes to the prime minister office, they're expecting a leadership change very soon. But given the North Korean threat, for example, like uh, like when North Korea didn't had missile strike capability, they could not directly threat Japan, but now they could actually fire a
Mhm.
nuclear tipped missile and actually target Tokyo, for example. So yes, there are geographical differences. We have different types of threats, but it has converged to some degree. So from Japan's perspective, South Korea's perspective, our threat perception has somewhat converged. And there might be some leadership who have a very radically having a different types of perception on security affairs. However, the structural constraint which have caused by regional actors like North Korea has have given very small room of maneuver for
Mhm.
both South Korean and Japanese leadership to maneuver. So they might be inaugurated. They might come with a new type of security policy. However, given the consensus, not only among the decision makers on the top, but also the public opinion, because public view is very, very important in Japan in order to revise the legal constraints, whatever. But anyways, I think the threat level that North Korea has raised has, given the leadership for both the South and Korea a very lesser room to maneuver. And I think there's no other ways but to cooperate with the two countries and to strengthen the trilateral security cooperation in the region. Or else it would be the leadership would be shown as very irresponsible to their constituents. That's my personal belief.
Do you think South Korea can and should push for greater voice in the US Indo-Pacific strategy without being perceived as overreaching? And do you think it would actually strengthen its importance as an ally to the US and make it less likely that US becomes indifferent or uninvolved regarding South Korea's security concerns?
Uh, can you reframe the question, the first part of your question?
To what
Mhm.
extent do you think South Korea can or should be pushing to become a more vocal party to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy? And do you think that that would help get wake U.S. up to the South Korean security concerns?
Okay, so one way is to have our own leverage against US is to, of course, increase our, responsibility in the regional security framework. So
Mm-hmm.
we tried that before. Like, for instance, we have sent peacekeeping operation to, for instance, Middle Eastern countries, but we avoided sending our troops into the conflictual zones, like in past Iraq. We were we did not positioned our forces into the direct conflictual parts, although we sent peacekeeping operations. But more directly to your question, uh, I guess one way to increase our leverage towards U.S. is first of all to provide. This is actually happening, but actually expanding our, like for instance, like MRO capabilities against like U.S. naval vessels. We are currently repairing and retrofitting them because they have a lack of manpower in doing so. So we can actually increase those type of role so that we can contribute to U.S. war fighting capability, giving more logistics. Or we could even suggest the U.S. This is a very sensitive issue, and actually, our
Mhm.
foreign minister have mentioned that this is not going to be in an official agenda. But we're all talking about what South Korea would do in a Taiwan contingency as a U.S. ally. Are we gonna, allow U.S. forces in Korea to be dispatched to the region, to the Taiwan Strait, if the crisis occur, or if we are we gonna like send our naval ships to near the Taiwan Strait in order to protect the SLOC sea lane of communication. Um, those types of discussions are made, uh, although it's highly sensitive, but there could be various ways, not necessarily you know um, escalating tensions in between China and South Korea, but nevertheless, there are ways that South Korea can enhance regional security in such crisis situation. And I think in that sense, those type of role that
Mhm.
South Korea could play would offer U.S. that South Korea could actually um, do more than just simply defending the South Korean territory only, but also extending their responsibility in securing the regional stability. So in that way, we can actually create some, grounds to persuade U.S. that South Korea can play a greater role than merely defending our territory.
Now, question that's been plaguing everyone is what lessons are to be drawn from U.S. Support or wavering support for Ukraine and the durability of U.S. commitments. Yes, on the one hand, there is this general rejection of certain things, but on the other hand, there are also commitments that U.S. has already made. Do you think South Korea can ultimately count on the U.S. given the precedent? Is it comparable to the Ukraine scenario in any way, or are there substantive differences?
Okay, so substantial difference exists. Most notably, we have a mutual defense treaty.
Hmm.
Well, it depends. Like it really depends on the U.S. Congress to decide whether to really
Hmm.
reinforce their troops to the Korean Peninsula if a full-fledged war occurs. But anyways, we have a mutual security treaty. So that's the most substantial difference between Ukraine and South Korea. However, there are logistics issues, and we are well aware that, like even with the U.S. capability, if multiple, conflict occur across the world, their military assets will be thinned out, and they're going to have to make a priority where to focus their, reinforcements and support. And I guess one of the concerning issue is that, like, if China invades Taiwan and North Korea, using that opportunistic situation to invade South Korea, and at the same time, the other, country, that Russia, if they try to invade another European country, U.S. will have to decide where to focus their, finite resources, military hardware. Uh, yes, on paper, U.S. is obliged to send the bulk of their reinforcements to the Korean Peninsula, but in that drastic situation, they're going to have to decide and they're going to have to prioritize given the U.S. national interest. And for South Korea, we have observed that for at least for Japan, for instance, their priority is not the defense of the Korean Peninsula. Their priority number one is to defend the Taiwan Strait because their materials are imported using that Taiwan Strait. So and Japanese territory is very near the Taiwan Strait, so they prioritize that region first. And together with the U.S., if Taiwan contingency and Korean contingency occur at the same time, it's very likely that not to mention Japan, but also U.S. Bulk of the U.S. would be defending Taiwan. But in that case, South Korea will have to, defend our territory
Mhm.
uh, without, U.S. support. So bearing that in mind, although we believe that U.S. on a rhetoric, U.S. has always constantly, declared that they were going to honor their commitment, and we routinely do exercises factor in those like all-out war scenarios. But I think for Korea, it is important for us to at least think the possibility of defending ourselves. And that is one of the reasons why we are churning out newer weapon systems and other defense frameworks that could at least independently, hold our position for a longer period of time.
Mhm.
That is our current developments. I think we cannot substitute, the U.S., element,
Mhm.
because I mean, we can create more platforms and we can, recruit more people. But I think in terms of intelligence and other, elements that cannot be easily substituted by the U.S., it will take a long period from now. But at least it is imperative for South Korea to, think that in a very drastic situation, U.S. help might not come as we have expected. So, yeah.
So, given that scenario, you've mentioned the trilateral China, Russia, North Korea alliance that has
Mhm.
emerged and developed from their relationships, but we're seeing something even more. We're seeing that at SEO, there's an effort to integrate capabilities not only of those three countries, but additional Asian actors, India, Pakistan, Central Asian states. Given this realignment of non-Western actors, what's South Korea's perception of this tendency? Is there an effort to build an alternative pro-Western but Asian based defense bloc to counter the SEO?
Okay. Right. Right. This might be the central kind of theme of probably today's discussion. Uh, but I think South Korea in that perspective is in a very uneasy position because in order to counter such type of development, there needs to be a possibility of creating collective security framework in this
Mhm.
region. Uh, and actually, the current Japanese Prime Minister have laid out an idea of creating an Asian version of NATO,
Mhm.
but it turned out to be very unrealistic at this juncture. And actually, there was a Asian version of NATO in the 1950s until 1970s called SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, but it didn't really consolidate it. It existed about like 20 years, but it just dissolute after the Vietnam War, the end of the Vietnam War. Um, but even creating a CETO 2.0 will not work because um, I think the cultural different, the background is very, very different from Europe. And although there are some discussions on creating a regional collective security structure, it didn't really work well. So I think the only viable security framework that is on the table at this juncture is to strengthen the trilateral security cooperation between U.S., Japan, and Korea into an elevated defense mechanisms. And by elevating means that I mean, already like U.S., Japan, and U.S., Korea has a very strong kind of level of security cooperations. But I'm meaning that between Japan and Korea, there are a lot of ways to reinforce their defense mechanisms. Um, so that's one way to do so. And uh, plus the trilateral security cooperation mechanisms, the U.S. and other countries in this region needs to connect Australia so that we
Mhm.
can make a quadrilateral kind of relationship. So that I mean, like building upon the existing framework is the realistic, ways that we can come up with. So I think beyond Australia, we don't really have a viable candidate at this juncture. I
Mhm.
mean, like South Korean government is now creating a um, um, narrative of defining South Korea as one of the leading middle powers in the world, a
Mhm.
democratic middle power,
Mhm.
so that we can align with the fellow middle powers, for instance, Canada. But in order to enhance our defense and deterrence against these probable adversaries in this region, we're going to have to bond with the peoples, the countries at the vicinity of Korea, and most realistically, Japan and
Mhm.
Australia is the only option that we have at this juncture.
What do you think about this growing convergence between China and Russia, and not only North Korea, but also Iran within multilateral institutions that South Korea is expanded from? And how can it battle the perception of being on the outs? Because for the US to not be part of Russia is natural. It has its own bloc, it's part of NATO. It doesn't need to be part of this international framework. But there is a growing trade, security, defense cooperation. Some of these countries are openly hostile to the West and to democracy and so forth. And some of them are likely to include meddling on a hybrid level, if not through direct kinetic attacks. Iran and South Korea may not have much, you know, in terms of direct confrontations, but if Iran perceives South Korea to be a pro-Western ally, it could certainly target it with cyber attacks, with terrorist attacks, and so forth. So, what do you think in terms of globalizing or internationalizing cooperation in that regard beyond regional frameworks?
So, as you pointed out, like from South Korea's perspective, many people who have this perception that we don't have anything to do with the Middle Eastern countries, for example, in terms of security. But that is wrong because there is a evidence that there was a huge kind of a level of cooperation between Iran and North Korea
Hmm.
in terms of missile capability and even nuclear kind of capability, sharing of information intelligence. Um, so it is wrong to define that we are only under the threat of North Korea, for example. It might appear in that way, but North Korea, China and Russia, plus other countries, which is situated across the Middle East, are aligning with one another as a anti-US regimes,
Hmm.
but as a U.S. ally in the Far East, we are the well target of these countries if they intend to, you know, be hostile to the U.S. And I think Iran might not directly conduct like military operations or a direct attack against like South Korea, but that can help or assist North Korea by giving their know-hows, or they can provide other military items like drones, so that they can indirectly harm, and crumble South Korean defense. So in one way or another, South Korea needs to really realistically evaluate the threats, how those alignments could, have upon our South Korean national interest. And one of the recent like policy recommendations I've made on this issue was like we got to really have to draw lessons from, for instance, the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance, which
Hmm.
countered the Russian Empire back then. So back then, UK and Japan was geographically on a very distant location, but in order to, you know, um, balance the superpower, the regional power in the land, the massive land in the middle. They had to make a very creative ways to align with one another. despite the long distance. So what I recommended recently was that although South Korea do not have any kind of well, there's some level of communications with the NATO countries, for example, but both with NATO and South Korea and Japan should come up with a more, strengthened like security cooperations or intelligence sharing or military exercises that factor in the scenario that Iran, Russia, North Korea, China could, you know, commonly conduct or together conduct, and should come up with some viable options. We should be well aware. And instead of like, reacting by
Mm-hmm.
South Korea alone, we're going to have to strategically come up with a coalition.
Mm-hmm.
Although we won't have any kind of a treaty with NATO, it's not going to happen. But we're going to have to find creative ways bypassing those treaties, um, absent treaties, but we can still find ways to cooperate given unprecedented threats. So yeah, that's a very urgent, I guess, like task for South Korea.
Are there any regional bodies where South Korea has either an observer or partner status that can be leveraged to mitigate risks of encirclement by SCO members?
Well, we are observer of the NATO
Mm-hmm.
conference. As I mentioned earlier, we have some degree of
Mm-hmm.
kind of linkage with NATO. Um, and of course, we have connections with other type of regional, framework, regional kind of regimes. However, I think what could directly, be effective against, those four countries that you've mentioned is NATO, and also, as I mentioned earlier, Australia and Japan needs to be, connected with South Korea in one way or another. And other than that, I think we don't really find any kind of a tangible regional security framework that we can actually use at this juncture. It's too indirect in my
Mm-hmm.
perspective. Yeah.
So, what happens in terms of South Korea's foreign policy if the show emerges as a viable counter-narrative to US-led alliances in Asia, and moreover, if it doesn't just become an alternative, a different club for people to join, but actually becomes more openly antagonistic to these alliances?
Uh, can you rephrase the question again? I just want to make sure that I've understood it clearly.
If the SEO
Mhm.
becomes a viable alternative to US-led alliances in Asia, and if it becomes more than
Uh,
just an alternative, but actually, or a counter narrative, but actually becomes more aggressively and
uh-huh.
openly antagonistic.
So if that happens, what South Korea would do?
Yes.
Oh, um, I think in that drastic situation, I think South Korea would have no option but to double down on the US, um, because like we South Korea believe that, for instance, we could actually divide our kind of approach. Like for instance, like we believed until very recently that South Korea can rely our security to the US, and we could still have a huge kind of a economic like interdependence with China. But as our newly elected president have recently gone to the White House and told Mr. Trump that we South Korea will double down on U.S. both in terms of security and economy, um, because U.S. has made a stance that um, that they're gonna have to distance with China, and I think South Korea has heavily relied on the U.S. And I think when it comes to a situation when U.S. gets apart with other countries, we're going to have to take sides. But given our reliance on US, not only in terms of security, but also economy and all sorts of elements, at least in the foreseeable future, we have no other options but to double down on US. And if SCO regime becomes so persuasive and so enticing that all regional powers, including ASEAN countries, join that regime, we might be hesitating. But unless we have our own independent kind of power, I mean, given the framework that we are now ensconced, like for instance, the Mutual Security Treaty and every types of like framework that we are now situated in, I think those changing situation might entice South Korea, but I think rationally speaking, South Korea would have to get closer to the US because that's the only option that we have. Yeah.
Given the divergent political trends in Japan and South Korea, they're seeing, a more populist party take up a lot of the seats in the recent elections. There in South Korea, on the other hand, a recent upheaval, which Western observers, by the way, are still struggling to understand, led to the election of a new president.
Mhm.
To what extent do you think uh, a more integrated cooperation is possible, or do you think the two countries are pursuing divergent political visions at the moment?
Okay, so good question. As you might know, our newly elected president is interpreted by the US, perceived by the US that he's kind of anti-Japan,
Hmm.
anti-US, and kind of a pro-China. I
Hmm.
mean, given his previous comments on those issues, there were, grounds to believe that once he become a president, he will be pursuing a very radical decisions, which would be very different from our previous president, which was a conservative. However, when he became president, at first, we expected that our expectations were right when Trump did not call him for acknowledgement for his election, results for many days. I think it's kind of out of the norm. But eventually, our president visited, the White House, and it was very surprising to see him, against all his like previous comments and his like very firm stance on Japan and US and whatever. He made a almost identical or even more positive kind of a stance and comments towards like security policies and alliance relationship and moreover the trilateral security cooperation, just like a conservative president. What he said was, as I pointed out earlier, whoever becomes the next Japanese prime minister, they said like they're gonna probably pursue the same, almost nearly the same policy as the current Ishiba prime minister. Um, is again, as I mentioned earlier, that given the heightened security threat, they understand, despite their own personal beliefs on certain matters, they have a very lesser room to maneuver. I mean, they can still insist taking, like for instance, like the current president, he can just insist, criticizing Japan for historical issues and whatever he believes that is right. However, if that develops further, I guess like the given the threat issues would prevail eventually, and it would actually backlash to the president. So I think both leaders of Korea and Japan kind of understands that the realistic options left for them is much fewer than they actually think. So being a candidate and coming into office is a very different thing, as you know. So they
Hmm.
kind of realize what is really happening, and they have advisors who actually come up with a very realistic like policy options. So
these recent developments, China, South Korea, and Japan concluded a trilateral trade treaty. What
Mhm.
impact has it had? Does it impact the security positioning at all? And can it compromise or, on the other hand, strengthen supply chains involving Japan and South Korea?
So you're referring to the trade pact with China, Japan, and Korea, right?
Mhm,
We're in a delicate situation. Uh, because coming back to the very beginning of this kind of podcast, we talked about South Korea's defense export, right?
mhm,
But despite our impressive export increase in recent years, many of the items that we export is heavily dependent on Chinese, materials,
mhm,
raw materials. Uh, and I'll just give it an example. Like, for instance, like tanks and howitzers, it's more like metallurgy, heavily reliant on metallurgy. So those are less dependent. But like missiles or avionics that has electronic components, they're heavily reliant onto, the Chinese export of their raw materials. So with the current level of, if any of the supply chain disrupts, meaning that if China declares that they're not going to sell any of those like items to South Korea, our defense export, all across the globe would, especially in terms of missiles and avionics, it's gonna, hit hard negatively. So I guess we are under the U.S. pressure that we're going to have to substantially reduce our, supply chain reliance on China, but it will not happen in a very short period of time. So we understand the U.S. call when we have decided to also enhance our interdependence with, U.S. But um, during our development of alternative supply chain, we're going to have to gradually reduce our reliance from China. But until that day come, we're going to have to soften the process, not a cold turkey approach, but a softening of the process. So I think in order to manage that process, I think South Korea and Japan have decided that it would be better to make some, consultations with Chinese and, come up with certain mechanisms, um,
mhm.
but I think eventually we're going to have to. I mean, South Korea is aiming for creating its own kind of a supply chain alternative path. Uh, right.
But at the same time, we're seeing that the US-based supply chain in South Korea is certainly one of the cooperating parties with the US and several other states on critical technical issues. Some would say that the US-based supply chain could be endangered by the Trump's tariffs policy, and we've seen, arguments over investments in the US that Trump is
Mhm.
demanding. We have seen the arguments over tariffs and whether to what extent the goods can be produced in the US versus outside the country. And we've certainly seen migration and labor disputes, including the recent unfortunate incident
Mhm.
involving South Korean workers in the US. How, wh- what does it mean for the current South Korean um, US trade and what security triggers could it indicate?
So it was an unfortunate event, the recent developments. But I think it's a process of adaptation. Yeah,
Hmm.
I strongly believe that this type of trend would not consistently continue in the days ahead.
Hmm.
Um, and I strongly believe that given the growing security environment, including the SCO kind of signals, would uh, would make US to decide for a more realistic approach vis-a-vis South Korea. I think um, so I think, coming back to this like recent events, the tariff issues and whatever, um, I think in in the foreseeable future, these issues will kind of subside. They'll be overwhelmed by other kind of security issues. I think the tariff issues are now being the main theme between alliances because there hasn't been a major threat that occurred in the region. But for instance, if China conducts a military operations against Taiwan, as it declared to do so, and not in the near future, I think all these tariff issues and other frictional issues that are damaging U.S. and its alliances would subside rapidly. But I have to realize that we have bigger issues to handle, and I think that moment will eventually come. That's my personal evaluation.
That brings me to the final two-part question related to all of this. To what degree does Beijing view Seoul's participation in US-led semiconductor restrictions as a hostile act rather than a defensive alignment? And given that concern, to what extent is there a risk of South Korea being drawn into a gray zone conflict in China, either in the Yellow Sea or in cyberspace, or both?
Okay, so if I have understood your questions correctly, the semiconductors in Taiwan, right?
Yeah, the basic cooperation framework with the US, Taiwan, and
Uh-huh.
other countries on semiconductors, to what extent, and the restrictions that are being imposed on China as part of this bloc, to what extent does China view it as a hostile act by South Korea, and what repercussions could that have? And also, to what extent is there a risk of a gray zone conflict with China, whether in the Yellow Sea or uh, whether or in the in cyberspace or elsewhere?
Uh, for instance, a direct military conflict with China is unlikely at this
Hmm.
juncture. However, I guess first of all, um, China, as it has shown its role during Korean War, it can indirectly support North Korea. So North Korea could conduct a cyber attack, but at the same time, China could also conduct, a cyber attack together with North Korea, given the situation, by sabotaging our kind of cooperation with the U.S. Our cooperation with the U.S. in terms of various topics, including the semiconductor issue. Um, and at the same time, even if we do not have any kind of conflictual relationship with North Korea for a while, if South Korea airs some idea that South Korea might support U.S. warfighting capability in Taiwan Strait in one way or another, China might do some provocative actions against South Korea. And that definitely includes those cyber attacks. And moreover, in the Yellow Sea, as you have mentioned, uh, we have official kind of demarcation line in terms of territory in the Yellow Sea. However, Chinese maritime vessels have violated and claimed to be their own territory. So those provocative actions may continue, and it might be even more provocative if South Korea maneuvers in a way that China don't want to see, or in a way that China consider as hostile. If we align our policy more to the US's preference, I think China, again, might not conduct a direct confrontation with Korea, but can conduct some provocative actions, including their provocation in the Yellow Sea and conducting, a cyber attack towards South Korea. So that's a real possibility, and the probability of conducting a gray war, operation against South Korea is quite high.
Thank you so much. This has been very, very insightful. And finally, just to wrap this up, what do you
Mhm.
think? What do you think should be done by the current Western powers um, and Asian powers that's not being done in terms of creating stronger security collaborations and cooperations, resolving differences, and creating mechanisms for sort of overcoming these miscommunications, misdivergences, and so forth?
Okay, so basically, we are democratic countries, so we're going to have to, face our domestic, political divergences. I mean, that's going to be a kind of a given, that we cannot ignore and change. However, we're going to have to maneuver with those like constraints as a democracy. What we need to do in the next few years is, first of all, we're going to have to come up with more corporations and give a unified signal to the SCO bloc.
Mm-hmm,
Um, um, I mean, we cannot come up with a unitary red line,
mm-hmm,
but we're going to have to convince them that if they cross the line, there will be consequences. It will be very important to convince them that there are going to be, consequences. And second measure that I think it's very necessary is both for Japan, Korea, and other NATO countries, we have agreed that we're going to increase our defense budgets in the coming days
mm-hmm,
ahead. But we're going to have to, make an effective way of really using these increases in a most effective way. So we don't have any collective security mechanisms, but we should not, you know, make redundant spendings
mm-hmm,
by spending on the same weapon systems, which would not enhance the regional security. So I'm not proposing a division of labor, but by
mm-hmm,
close coordination, we would kind of coordinate, and we can make a very effective like defense layers
mm-hmm.
by knowing what is the most weak points, what is most needed in the certain region for NATO countries and for the Far Eastern countries in here. So those type of coordination is very necessary, and we still have time to make such close coordinations because the defense budget increase is not. It's going to happen in the coming years ahead, not days ahead. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it should be not wasted. It should be effectively procured by most needed weapon systems, and it should be operated in the most effective manner that benefits not only a single country, but all the democratic countries, both in Far East and in the European Union. So that's my two policy recommendations for the democratic countries.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and your insights. This was a very illuminating conversation, and I hope anyone watching it will learn from the key takeaways about the fact that the situation is much more complicated than meets the eye. And I think that even the U.S. administration should be open to listening more and consulting more closely with its allies to
Mhm,
inform its decision making. I think
mhm,
that's the main thing that I hope gets out there. There's certainly a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of common ground that can be successfully exploited. And for everyone watching us, we were discussing South Korea's security and geopolitical concerns with Dr. Ju Hong Kim, and
mhm.
we'll be back on the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio next Tuesday night, as always, 9 p.m. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great evening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.